Nicole Carter, an agent, was accustomed to blending in, but tonight she felt as though everyone in the restaurant was staring at her. There were challenging moments during her tenure as a secret FBI agent, but this time her concerns weren't about thieves. The uniformed officer was walking right toward her, and his beliefs were already flashing in his eyes. "Before we start, don't you think? Don't forget to sign up and tell us where you're watching from." Agent Naomi Carter changed the band on her bracelet. It was a thin silver band that looked like The stylish edition concealed a high-tech recorder. She surveyed the room from her spot next to the stylish edition. At the back of the fancy diner, her eyes remained sharp, despite her apparent calmness. She had trained herself to look this way. She could fit in anywhere, but tonight she was more aware of her surroundings than ever. This fancy restaurant wasn't just a place for food, it was also a spot for the city's most important people to get together. Naomi was working secretly in a key location where an investigation into an international money laundering ring was still ongoing. The task was very important to her. Her target, Leonard Marquez, was a charming investor with ties to illegal activities. It was her responsibility to gather evidence that individuals were transferring funds through legitimate businesses, such as this restaurant. It was done discreetly, without any mistakes and without any publicity. Tonight was meant to be normal. There was monitoring, but Naomi had a strong feeling that something was wrong with the others. Straw was surrounded by well-dressed individuals in white, who appeared unaffected by her presence, despite her presence. She could feel their eyes on her, and the slight discomfort of being the only black woman in a sea of white women. She moved a little in her chair and ran her fingers along the edge of the menu to make it look like she was busy. A waiter came up to her and offered her a wine list with a friendly but distant smile. He was trying to be professional, but his discomfort showed Naomi had seen this before, behavior 1,000,000 times before. The quick, sharp looks and the small pause in tone, as if they were all wondering why she was here, when she wasn't there to worry about how they saw her. She had work to do. The voice of her handler buzzed softly from the earpiece she had hidden under her dark, curly hair. "Mark Williams, Naomi stay sharp, and Mark have just arrived at the bar." She looked over to the bar and saw Marquez shaking hands with some of his friends while they laughed. If he didn't care about anything, she felt a rush of excitement. They had been planning the surgery for months, and tonight was the night it would take place. It seemed like the mood in the room changed all of a sudden, and Naomi saw it before she saw the cause of something in the quiet talks coming from the stares of the customers. Pronounced, she followed their line of sight to the front door, where a tall police officer walked in. He was large and exuded the confidence of someone accustomed to leadership. He looked around the room. With the goal of a man on a mission, Naomi could tell it wasn't about the safety of the restaurant. Thompson was a familiar face to her. He was a police officer with a reputation for rudeness. He was sure of his own superiority and wasn't afraid to show it. Naomi quickly dropped her eyes, acting like she didn't see him. She concentrated on her menu to avoid his notice, but the pain in her stomach told her something was wrong. It was too late. He had already seen her, and she could feel him moving toward her. "Miss," he said. He stopped in front of her table and spoke in a strong, authoritative voice. Naomi looked up and met his eyes. She maintained a neutral expression to conceal the growing anger within her. The officer looked her over once, his brow furrowing slightly, as if he were trying to put her in her place. "Could you please explain your situation?" Naomi's heart beat faster, but her face stayed calm. "I'm just Officer Thompson didn't seem to know." Officer Thompson glanced at her table and noticed that there was no food present. The restaurant as if to say, "You don't belong here." And his face turned serious. "I'm going to need some help." No, this wasn't included in the plan for Naomi's cover as a regular patron. She tried to keep Thompson out of sight, but her presence was making things more difficult than she could manage. She could have blown her secret by saying no, but she also couldn't say who she really was. "I'm sorry, but why are you asking for my ID?" Naomi asked in a calm voice. "Is there a problem?" Naomi's jaw hardened as she said, "You don't seem to belong here. I've heard a few complaints about you." She was aware that this wasn't her first assessment and probably wouldn't be her last. Some people were suspicious because she was black and in a fancy restaurant, but she needed to focus on the task at hand. She couldn't afford any disruptions. She kept her movements calm and got there. Thompson didn't say a word as she reached into her bag and pulled out her ID. He looked at her name and picture with doubt and said, "Naomi Carter." He then looked at her again and said, "You don't look like Naomi Carter. Someone who would be eating here by themselves. What's really going on?" Before Naomi could answer, Marquez walked in. She cast a glance in her direction from the bar. It was the worst possible time for this argument, and she couldn't risk making things worse. "Officer, pay attention," she said quietly. "I'm not making a scene. I'm just here. If there's nothing else you can do, I'd like to finish my meal." Thompson wasn't backing down. "I'm sorry. I need you to accompany me as I ask further questions." Naomi's heart was racing, but she kept her cool. It wasn't possible to break cover yet. "Is that really necessary?" "I haven't done anything." Despite his error, Thompson was already requesting assistance with a smile on his face. As much as he liked having power over the situation, Naomi was just another black woman to him. Didn't fit here. Naomi's mind was racing. If you don't do something quickly, this could put the whole case at risk. But as Thompson's backup came, she grabbed Naomi's arm, knowing she had to go along for the moment. As she walked out of the restaurant wearing handcuffs, the diners murmured and ascended the stairs in her wake. It hurt, but what hurt even more was realizing that her carefully planned mission was now in danger. As the cool night air hit Naomi's face, she kept her eyes on the road and started to plan her next move. This wasn't over yet. Naomi could definitely feel the cold metal of the handcuffs digging into her. Officer Thompson tightly gripped her arms and pushed her into the back seat of the squad car. The heavy slam of the door hit her hard. Hearing the sound of a car door in the empty street reminded her of how quickly things had gotten out of hand. She was only seconds away from obtaining crucial information for the FBI's case, but she received disrespectful treatment. Despite her mind racing, the common thief appeared calm on the outside. Despite their training for high-stress situations, the injustice of the moment persisted. She found it challenging to hold back her anger. This wasn't just a mistake by a neighborhood police officer. It was the clearest example of prejudice. In her mind, she played over the scene. Thompson walked into the restaurant, looked around, and then fixed his attention on her. Almost right away, there were no questions about her appearance, no real interest, just Thompson hadn't wasted any time making assumptions based on the color of her skin. Even though she might fit in, he didn't even think about it. It was like a black woman couldn't be there in his thoughts. Perhaps they are dining at such a prestigious restaurant for a valid reason. When the car jerked forward, it woke Naomi up from her thoughts. Officer Thompson sat in the front, smug and sure of himself. Officer Richards, his partner, sat next to him in silence as he gripped the wheel with a sense of pride that made her feel bad. Naomi, who had been watching the whole thing, wondered if Richard shared Thompson's narrow-minded views or if he was just being silly. Too guilty to speak out, Thompson looked at her in the rearview mirror, his eyes harsh and critical. You have a lot of nerve," he said, his voice full of sneer. "You were acting so high and mighty back there, you know. There was no way you could have been fooling anyone at that place." Naomi's jaw tensed. She had to be careful. Giving away her real name now could put the whole case at risk, but Cade was trying to go along with it, her patience in a way that few other things ever had. "I was having dinner," she said, keeping her cool. "Is that a crime?" Thompson laughed and shook his head, as if her answer was funny dinner. He paused, allowing his words to linger in that moment. "You say Naomi's chest got hot, but she didn't give in. She knew exactly what Thompson was getting at, and the racial undertones of what he said didn't escape her. She had seen it too many times before. The shock that someone like her might fit in places that are usually only for rich and powerful people, but this time there was more at stake. She wasn't just dealing with general prejudice, she was dealing with a guy who was letting his personal views get in the way of his professional judgment. Thompson kept driving his. There was a lot of silence, broken only by occasional looks in the rearview mirror. The tension in the car was obvious, but Naomi stayed calm and kept her mind on the bigger picture. This wasn't just about her. Mission had to come first, even if it meant having to deal with this shame for a little while longer. A few minutes later, Thompson noticed long shadows cast across the sidewalk by the bright lights of the building. Naomi was roughly pulled out of the car by her arm as the driver got out of the way. Naomi moved a little as the cuffs sank deeper. She wouldn't let him see her in by putting his hands on her arms. "Pain, let go," he whispered as he led her to the door by holding her arm. Was way too tight, as if he wanted to show his power one last time as they walked through the front doors of the station. The mood changed. Several officers looked up, their eyes slightly widening as they saw Naomi in handcuffs. She could tell that some of them were confused and didn't know if they recognized her or not. They were just shocked to see a well-dressed black woman being treated like a criminal. Officer Richards walked in behind them and stayed quiet, but Naomi could feel how uneasy he was. It was like he knew. They knew this was wrong, but they weren't brave enough to tell Thompson Naomi so. Thompson took mental notes on his actions. Everything could come in handy later. He almost didn't notice the other officers as they passed as they led her to the waiting area. He was too focused on staying in charge, and his pride was clearly swollen from what he saw as a successful arrest. When they got to the holding cell, he took Naomi's handcuffs off, pushed her inside, and slammed the door shut. It was dark, but you could hear the clang of the bars behind her. "Stay put," he told her in a low, joyful voice. "Someone will be in to talk." Naomi didn't answer. She just turned around and sat on the metal bench against the wall, her eyes on Thompson, who stood there and stared back at her for a moment, as if he were trying to scare her even more. Naomi wouldn't flinch, so he finally turned around and left her alone. In her cell, Naomi took a slow breath. Her heart was still beating fast from the excitement. She felt frustrated as she looked at the red marks on her wrists where the cuffs had rubbed against her skin. She needed to maintain her composure, as she was still underground, and the job was not yet complete. Why would she? It was time to talk about what had happened, but first she had to get out of this mess without blowing her cover. Cover her earpiece. The earpiece gently buzzed, prompting Naomi to adjust her hair to enhance her listening experience. Naomi could clearly hear Special Agent Williams' voice over the commotion. Naomi mumbled something under her breath while keeping her voice low, so the station's cameras wouldn't pick up the conversation. "Thompson's out of control. We're trying to get you under control. We need to get out of there, but we can't threaten the investigation." Naomi clenched her hands and said, "I know I'm playing it. We have a limited amount of time. Marquez witnessed the entire event, and if he finds any issues, we've already addressed them." Naomi sighed and leaned back against the cold. "Sit tight. This will end soon." She didn't like being helpless, especially when so much was at stake, but she had to trust her team, would not leave her waiting. As Naomi sat in her cell, each minute felt like an hour. The sounds of the station entered from the hallway, drowning out conversations, footsteps, and the odd phone ringing. As hard as she tried to concentrate on the next steps of the task, Thompson kept coming back to her mind. He didn't care about her rights. He was cocky, and he wouldn't see her as anything but in a broad sense. He didn't know who she really was, and Naomi knew when he did. He would feel terrible about everything he did, but for now she waited outside, biting her lips. Thompson walked back and forth in his cell, still excited about his so-called victory. Naomi, on the other hand, knew the truth. Things like that would happen to people like him, and it wouldn't be pretty. Naomi was beginning to lose her cool as she sat on the cold metal bench inside the holding cell. Her mind was running with the possible results. She had been through tougher situations before, but this one felt extra heavy. As she thought back on the events that led to her arrest, she felt a heavy sense of injustice. This wasn't just a nuisance or a harmful police practice. It was a clear abuse of power made worse by Officer Thompson's because of his race, and he had no idea how badly he had guessed that the station was silent. Occasionally, Naomi could hear the buzzing sound of fluorescent lights flashing in the room. She shifted slightly in the hallway outside her cell, attempting to find a comfortable position, but the uncluttered environment prevented her from doing so. The handcuffs were still hurting her wrist, making it impossible, and her thoughts kept returning to Leonard's surgery. Marquez had probably seen the whole fight at the table if he thought she was more than a typical customer. For the ego of a typical customer, the study could be in danger. One cocky police officer's earpiece buzzed again, and it was the voice of Special Agent Williams. The words flowed smoothly, slightly skewed, yet easily comprehended by Naomi. "Stay cool. Things are moving quickly." She whispered back, trying not to draw attention to herself. "I'm calm. However, the situation is deteriorating, and Marquez could potentially become involved. Pay attention. We've already sent a group to the restaurant Williams to make things better." The man's voice grew slightly more urgent. "Thompson Uke, be out of there soon. We've made some calls." Naomi gave herself a thankful nod, glad that her team had her back. Sitting in a cell, degraded and treated like a criminal, was not something she could quickly overcome. This was particularly significant, given that her entire role had been to uphold justice. Thompson had done just that. He wasn't like her at all. Naomi heard a loud noise outside the holding cell, along with the sound of cops talking quietly. She couldn't understand all the words because of the tight tones, but she could tell right away that something was changing. She stood up and paced the small area, hoping that whatever was going on would turn out well. It wasn't long before an officer named Thompson showed up again, but this time his normal swagger was a little less noticeable. He appeared nervous, yet he made an effort to maintain his confidence. Captain Edwards, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a serious look in his eyes, stood behind him calmly. He saw Naomi in the holding area and immediately locked onto her. Officer Thompson and Captain Edwards both heard his words. "Can you tell me why this woman is in a holding cell?" Thompson's face changed, and he stuttered a little before she was behaving strangely at the restaurant, sir. "I was troubled by her peculiar behavior at the restaurant. I felt that questioning her would be the most effective approach." Captain Edwards raised an eyebrow and didn't seem pleased by Thompson's complaints. "I paused a few times with customers. I didn't get their names, but I fulfilled my obligations." It got colder. "Are you telling me that you brought this woman in because she didn't fit your idea of who should be out at that time?" Thompson gritted his teeth in defense, and I had a reason to. I believed that she was engaging in an unlawful activity. However, I was simply fulfilling my obligations. Captain Owens took a quick look at Naomi, who was standing behind bars in silence. Naomi's eyes met his with a calm look. He looked back at Thompson with anger, clearly not pleased by what he had to say. "Officer, do you have any proof of this?" Thompson's face turned a little red. Is this really a crime, or are you just making assumptions about people based on how they look? When the captain looked at her closely, her bluster started to fall apart. She refused to work with him, but she didn't refuse anything else. A voice from behind them cut them off, and Naomi's heart rate went up as she saw Special Agent Williams. He was tall and dressed in a smart suit. His hard eyes captured the attention of everyone in the room. Thompson immediately changed the mood in the room. Williams was that kind of man. Just being present was sufficient to make one's voice heard. Authority. Hello, my name is Kurt Williams, and I'm a special agent with the FBI. I think you've made it. Captain Edwards made a significant error, expressing his disapproval of the deteriorating situation. Agent, I'm sorry for the confusion. We didn't know that Williams had cut him off. Naomi Carter is one. Tonight, one of my most skilled spies embarked on a clandestine mission that was vulnerable to hacking. Your officer's eagerness prompted Thompson, who appeared shaken, to step forward, sir. I didn't know you didn't. You don't know because you didn't ask William. He stated icily that you saw a black woman in a fancy restaurant and assumed she wasn't the culprit. Thompson stuttered as he tried to explain himself, but the room was silent, was already turning against him. It was clear that Captain Edwards' face had turned dark. He wasn't going to protect Thompson from the fallout. Special Agent Williams Edward told him, I'll make sure that this is taken care of right away, that Officer Thompson's acts are fully investigated, and that Agent Carter is freed right away. Williams quickly agreed. That's the very least Naomi could do was watch as Captain Edwards told one of the other officers to open her cell door. When the metal door opened, it was a welcome sound, but she was still upset about what had happened. She stepped out, straightened up, and refused to show any signs of the shame she had just experienced. Thompson dodged her look. He was no longer arrogant. He understood the gravity of his mistake, and Naomi accepted it. Take a deep breath and tell yourself that this isn't about your pride. It's about a much bigger trend that has been going on for a long time. People like Thompson often engage in tracking and discrimination without any consequences. Williams caught Naomi's eye as she walked past him and gave her an encouraging nod. Okay, I'll be Naomi, he said. Mr. Williams said in a low voice, We need to move quickly. Marquez might be onto us after that scene. First, let's get you out of here. As they made their way toward the station's exit, Naomi glanced in her direction. Thompson stood there with his face red with shame and his eyes fixed on the ground. He had placed her down, arbitrarily detained her, and attempted to restrain her, but now the situation had shifted. His job was at stake. As she strolled past the talking cops, she could discern fragments of their conversations. Thompson, some people were shaking their heads and whispering about what was going to happen next. You could feel the chatter inside the police station, and Naomi knew that Thompson's time as an officer was almost up. Karma was already at work when they walked outside. The cool night air hit her, and she took a deep breath, feeling a sense of relief. Williams quickly tapped her on the shoulder and told her, You did good in there. Naomi responded, I didn't feel like it. Her voice was tired. You kept your cool, William. It's crucial that you kept him at bay. Naomi agreed, but the anger was still building up below the surface. He's going to have to deal with the results, right? Williams glanced at her and stated, Thompson has completed his task. We'll investigate him, and I'm confident we'll find him. Naomi slowly exhaled. She could finally relax her shoulders. The fight wasn't over yet, but she had won it. It was time to get Naomi to turn her attention back to the job at hand as she and Williams walked toward the black SUV stopped at the curb. Nobody could take their minds off of what had happened that night. Someone had profiled, shamed, and jailed her after witnessing her actions. People thought she wasn't human, but she didn't let that break her. And in the end, it was Naomi and Thompson, who had lost everything, who felt the cold night air. Agent Williams entered the parked black SUV outside the police station. Naomi could still feel the tightness in her muscles, a reminder of the recent injustice she had experienced. Her wrists were still swollen. The pins embedded in her skin during the car's motion caused her pain. Naomi leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes for a moment to calm down. The engine began to hum. She found herself inside the station, but karma was already beginning to work its magic. Thompson walked back and forth in the empty hallway. His face was flushed and his chest ached from anger. Shame. He had always thought he was above blame, and that he was the type of cop who went with his gut. But today his feelings put him in great danger, leading him to arrest an undercover FBI agent. A woman whose qualifications were better than his by miles hit Captain Edwards like a punch in the gut. He stood at the far end of the hallway and engaged in a quiet conversation with a group of police officers. Thompson could tell by the way he moved. They looked at him quickly, their faces changing from surprise to disapproval. As words spread quickly, the normal buzz at the station had dwindled to almost nothing. Police and workers whispered about Thompson's spill. Thompson. Captain Edwards' sharp voice woke him up. He turned around and pushed his legs to move evenly. The captain's eyes, fixed on him with a mix of sadness and anger, felt like lead. Thompson had seen that look on his boss's faces before. It was how they looked when they knew someone had crossed a boundary. What did Edward say? "I need you to come with me." Kurt didn't wait for him to finish. Thompson responded by pirouetting and heading towards his office. The walk to the office seemed to last forever for each of them. Each step echoed down the hallway, intensifying the situation. Thompson knew this wasn't going to end well. To serve as a clear warning, his actions went beyond the typical mistakes he had made. He racially profiled a woman who wasn't guilty, as well as a government agent. And now in the inside Captain Edwards' office, where the air was thick with stress, chaos was bound to happen. Edwards waved for Thompson. The officer refused to sit down, and instead stayed standing. He was too restless to relax, and his mind was racing with ideas, searching for a reason to justify his actions. He tried to find any reason that would make the damage less bad, but he knew there was no way to explain what he had done. Edwards closed the door behind them and took a seat at his desk. He looked at Thompson with a focused look. There was a long moment of quiet, broken only by the sound of the clock on the wall. Edwards finally spoke up, his voice tense with anger. "What the hell were you thinking?" "I didn't know she was FBI." Thompson spoke slowly and stutteringly. "She didn't know what?" he said. Edwards told him sharply. "That person didn't sound like the kind of person who should be sitting in a nice chair." His patience was running thin. Restaurant Thompson opened his mouth to argue, but the captain didn't say a word. Edwards leaned forward to examine the charge, which was too true to deny. "Just to be clear, what you did tonight wasn't just a mistake. It was a violation. You racial profiled a woman who wasn't guilty and arrested her without a good reason. And now the whole you are keeping an eye on the precinct." Thompson's heart sank as the full weight of what he had done hit him. He said it in a weak voice, but he could hear that it sounded hollow. "You thought she was suspicious." Edward confronted her directly about her race, and his words pierced the room with a sharp edge. "You didn't even try to judge him. Taking into account the facts, you only thought Thompson was feeling uncomfortable." The captain's anger was fully expressed. "I was just trying to do my job," he said, even though he knew it wasn't true. That wasn't enough for Edwards, who shook his head in sadness. "Thompson, it is your responsibility to safeguard individuals and adhere to the rules without exception." Thompson curled his hands at what you did tonight because of bias. Now we're all going to pay for it, he said. He felt his anger rising to the surface. He wasn't accustomed to receiving such harsh criticism, and it caused him discomfort. Some of the captain's words hit him harder than he thought they would, but he couldn't fight with the truth. He had been wrong about what he thought. Tell him what to do, as his job is now in danger, and we're starting an internal investigation. An investigation into your behavior is underway, Edwards said in a louder voice. Start immediately. Your suspension ended pending the investigation, Edwards said in a louder voice. Thompson, I think you should give your future some serious thought because it doesn't look promising after this. Good. The word struck Thompson with force, halting his progress. He had a sick feeling in the pit of his stomach, and his mind was moving quickly. One night put his job, his reputation, and everything he had worked for in jeopardy. At one point, he let his beliefs cloud his judgment, and he stood there speechless. Captain Edwards watched him for one more second as the weight of the situation fell heavily on his shoulders. He let go with a simple wave of his hand. You're fired, Thompson, Thompson said. Make sure you have your gun and badge before you leave. His throat got tight as he nodded. As he walked down the hallway, his feet moved automatically toward the door. Officers who had once greeted him with respectful nods of the head now avoided his eyes. Their faces showed a mix of sadness, and the whispers looked down on him as he turned in his gun and badge, and the final act outside the station sealed his fate. Thompson stood there for a long time and stared up at the stars. The world felt different without him. Just hours before, he had been a proud and respected police officer, but he had let his bias control his actions. Now he had to deal with the results. Naomi was quiet in the SUV. The events of the night were still fresh in William's mind, so she drove alone for a few minutes before finally saying, "Don't worry about breaking it, Naomi. We'll take care of him." Naomi breathed out and nodded, but she still had a hollow feeling in her chest. "It's not about him," she said quietly. Voice steady but worn out. "It's about what he stands for. There are countless people who admire him, and this is just one instance." Williams looked at her. "I understand her meaning, but we're moving forward gradually." Naomi looked out the window. She had dealt with prejudice all her life, but as she watched the city lights flash by, tonight served as a stark reminder of how deeply ingrained the irony was in the system, despite her efforts to protect it. She understood that despite her daily efforts to uphold the law, she could still become a victim of the very same. "Sometimes it seems like it will never change," she said, referring to the system she worked for herself rather than to Williams. Williams remained silent for a brief moment before responding. "Get what's coming to them. Maybe not right away, but in the end," Naomi nodded, feeling tired all the time. Thompson had previously dealt with the consequences of his actions, but this was just one instance. This was just one battle in a much bigger war. The fight for justice was far from over. As she entered the FBI field office, Naomi experienced a renewed sense of motivation. Tonight had been a defeat, but that wasn't the end. She wasn't going to let one racist police officer stop her mission. Regardless of her goal, she exited the car and promptly returned her focus to the investigation. Karma had caught up with her. She still had work to do. Marquez was still out there, and the door was still open when she walked into the building, with her head held high. Naomi was sure of one thing. No matter how many, she would keep fighting no matter what, and one day her sister Sai would win. Fought to protect. The system also ensured the safety of Naomi Carter. As she approached the FBI field office, the events of the previous night continued to weigh heavily on her. The cold air outside contrasted sharply with her mood. Every step she took toward the office, the warm lights of the building in front of her, made her feel more and more frustrated. Even though it was quiet and machines were humming, the pain of what had happened was still there. Conversation welcomed her back, and Special Agent William walked up to her with his usual calm attitude and gave her a Naomi liked Williams's support. He was there through all of tonight's chaos, but she knew this fight was coming. Was bigger than anything they'd dealt with in one evening, Naomi. I know it wasn't straightforward tonight, but I need to ask Williams why he stopped raising his voice. They walked down the empty hallway. Are you sure you want to go ahead with the operation we can pull off? You can take a break if it becomes too overwhelming. After what happened, no one would blame you. Naomi paused and looked at Williams. She cared about her, but the fire in her chest hadn't gone out yet. Her shape had only changed. She was less angry and more focused. She knew what was at stake. Plans to follow Leonard Marquez were still alive, and months of hard work could fail if she didn't stay the course. More importantly, leaving now would mean allowing the prejudice she had just experienced to prevent her from achieving her goal. Naomi said with a strong voice, "We can't let what happened happen again. Tonight, stop us. Marquez is still out there, and he knows something happened. We need to be careful about what we do next." Williams said, "Or we could lose everything." He nodded, but he looked at her face for any signs. "Naomi, you're sure this isn't just about showing something to someone, right?" Naomi managed a small smile, even though she was very tired. "You've already shown more than enough strength tonight," pulled at her. "I'm sure it's not about proving anything to anyone. It's about if I do my job well, Thompson doesn't take charge." Williams gave her a firm nod. "With permission, we'll get back together tomorrow morning to talk about the arrest and figure out how to keep the plan going. Get some rest, Naomi. You've earned it. Don't tell Marquez about it." She thanked him and proceeded towards the elevator. As she did so, the quiet hum of the FBI building faded into the background. As the doors closed, there was quiet inside. It was the first time all night that she let herself go, feel how what had happened made them feel. The fear, the anger, the shame and humiliation all sank into her chest like a heavy stone. She kept playing over and over the scene in the restaurant. Once again, she was struck by Thompson's arrogant voice, the crowded stares, and the tight grip of the chains as they bit into her skin. It wasn't just about that. It was also about being told that, no matter how well, despite her exceptional skills and training, some people continued to perceive her as inferior to them. The doors opened, and Naomi walked in. She took a deep breath and focused on the job at hand as she walked out into the parking lot. The cool air felt beneficial against her skin. She was strong because she had to be. Not her first time dealing with prejudice, and likely not her last. Last, but not least, she wouldn't let it define her. When Naomi got to her car, her phone buzzed in her pocket and she took it out. When she looked down, she saw an unknown number flash on the screen. She frowned and answered slowly. "Hello," the voice on the other end said. At the end, it became clear who it was. Officer Mark Thompson and Agent Carter. Not boastful like the people she had heard earlier that night. "I know this. It may come as a surprise, but I need to discuss something with you." She had a tight grip on her phone tonight, and her first thought was to hang up. Thompson wasn't sure what to say. Maybe having to say that would change anything about what had happened, but she couldn't because she was interested, and for a deeper reason. Back then, maybe it was the part of her that always believed in holding people responsible and giving them a chance to, even if they didn't earn it, they should explain themselves, Naomi said. Thompson didn't say anything again for a long time after the other end of the call ended. Her tone was flat. "Please forgive me. I know what I did was wrong, but I didn't realize how wrong it was until I arrested you tonight. I was not contemplating. I was merely responding to my own thoughts, and that is my responsibility." Naomi listened in silence, her mind racing. She was indifferent to Thompson's presence. Epiphany, or whether he felt bad because the damage had been done, and his revelation, while important to him, didn't make up for the damage he did. "I've been grounded, and I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry, but I didn't want to start an investigation." Thompson spoke less loudly, as if he were saying his words were still fresh in our minds. "I know that doesn't change what happened, but I'm trying to figure out what I did." Naomi slowly released her breath. She didn't owe him anything, but she did think people should take responsibility for their actions. She wasn't going to lie and say that his AP class made things better, but she did appreciate it when he took responsibility. Even though it was too late, the fact that he had come to her, Thompson began to speak in a cool but strong manner about what had happened tonight. It wasn't just a mistake. It revealed a larger issue that everyday people like me have to deal with. "I'm glad you understand that what you did was wrong, but that doesn't change the fact that you broke the rules. Did it on your own." Thompson was quiet for a moment, and Naomi could almost hear the moving parts in his mind. "I understand, and I don't anticipate your forgiveness." I just said to herself, "I need you to know that I'm going to do better and deal with whatever comes from this." She knew that this talk wouldn't change her life much, because it wasn't about Thompson's redemption. It was about the bigger system that let people like him keep thinking the way they did. "I hope you do the same." Naomi answered, "Know that what you did has consequences, and it's not enough to just feel bad about it. What you do next is what makes a difference." Thompson agreed and muttered it. After an unusual pause, he ended the call. Naomi returned her phone to her pocket, experiencing an unfamiliar feeling. It wasn't forgiveness or healing, it was just the end. Thompson's admission that he did wrong, and her admission that there was a fight. She remained ahead of her as Naomi drove home, watching the city lights flash by. She thought about all the other people who had been through the same thing tonight, but didn't have the stage or power to speak out. Back then, she was fortunate to have her badge, which protected both her job and her relationships. But what about those who didn't? There was no system in place to assist them, and the journey ahead was arduous. Things weren't going to change overnight, but Naomi wasn't fighting alone, and she wasn't going to give up when she finally did. When she got home, she parked her car and sat in it for a moment, taking in the peace and quiet. The night was over, but the battle for Naomi Carter was strong, but justice that would last was still a long way off. It had to be, and tomorrow she would continue to do the work she was meant to do. Thanks for watching, and let us know if you liked it. Don't miss the next story. Click on the video to watch it now. Thanks for your help, and please let us know what you think in the comments.